Hi, I'm Alison Dover, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Secondary Education. So this example comes from one of my undergraduate and post-baccalaureate classes, EDSC 330, which is Developing Literacy in Secondary Schools. This course is a required prerequisite for students who are interested in our single subject teacher credential program, so students who want to be middle or high school teachers. In this class, students learn strategies for supporting literacy development among culturally and linguistically diverse middle and high school students. They examine state standards related to students' reading, writing, and speaking and listening, and they create their very first lesson plans. Now, I came up with this example when COVID required us to shift to online learning, and my courses shifted to fully online synchronous classes. This created opportunities to model effective online and distance-based teaching, but also introduced new challenges in building classroom community. This virtual locker activity was designed to help students introduce themselves to their peers, to model strategies for culturally and linguistically inclusive teaching, and also challenge future teachers to begin thinking about how to design lessons that reflect the interests, the identities, and the passions of their students. While this was originally designed specifically for future teachers, students love the activity, and I've since incorporated it into all of my online courses, both synchronous and asynchronous classes. So in this activity, students are tasked with creating a virtual locker that features artifacts related to the diverse facets of their identities. I usually introduce the activity during the first class after we talk about why it's important to know who our students are, and then use my own locker to introduce myself to the class. And you have access to my locker as well as the template in the attached files. When I highlight my locker, I'm really careful to talk about which aspects of my identity I chose to include in my locker, and do that really strategically to make sure that I'm sharing the parts of myself with students that I want them to know about during our first class. For example, I talk about being a first-generation college graduate. I talk about having two moms. I talk about being committed to building a classroom that embraces students of all identities. I also share tidbits about myself. I love to bike. I love to cook. I have small kids, and so I understand some of the dilemmas associated with balancing life and classes and what have you. I talk about the book that I've written and how exciting it was for me to be an author and what that means. And I talk to them about how we can all begin to think about introducing ourselves to our future students in ways that help model the kind of classroom community we want to create. As I go through the artifacts in my locker, I talk about the different types of tech tools that we can use to integrate things. For example, I have links to some video recordings and audio of my favorite songs. I have links to photographs of when I took students on a study abroad experience and what have you. And so I model what the process is like of creating a Google slide and then linking in artifacts. I also talk about the ways that we can use the speaker notes associated with a Google presentation to ensure that our slides are accessible. So this is a very audio and visually heavy activity, which creates accessibility issues for students who use screen readers. So I talk about the importance of including alt text for any of our images so that our students are able to access what they need. I then introduce the formal instructions for the activity and give students a template and some resources to use when they're designing their own locker. Again, using the speaker notes in the presentation to give them some tips, and then also to model the process of giving credit to the person who created this particular template. Students then have a week to create their lockers and add them to our class slide deck, and I create a separate deck for each of my classes. During our next synchronous meeting, students share their lockers in breakout groups and use a graphic organizer, usually a Venn diagram, to identify some similarities and differences among the students in their groups. In my asynchronous classes, I'll task students with looking at all of the lockers, choosing 5 to 7 other students, and then doing a spider web style organizer, identifying some of their commonalities. For example, it might say something like, I like cooking, and so does Anaï. Anaï is a first-generation student, and so is Patrick. Patrick plays basketball, and so does Daniela, and so on. The point is to help students think about the ways that they're connected to their peers, and to really recognize that none of them are alone. I then ask students to begin brainstorming some of the ways a teacher could use an activity like this to think about connecting classroom content to students' interests. For example, if someone puts a basketball in their locker, a physics teacher might suggest a lesson about the trajectory of a basketball in a court. Or a future language arts teacher might use a student's favorite song to inspire a lesson about rhythm or rhyme or figurative language, and so forth. And I come back to this activity multiple times throughout the semester. And in the attached slides and documents, I give some examples of the types of lessons I do. But I always use this activity to remind my students that when they're teachers, they'll be teaching real live people. They're not going to be teaching sort of empty slates or stereotypes of students, but students that have interests and passions and hopes and aspirations. And I remind them that it's our job as educators to connect back to that. And I model it for them during class. I bring in, for example, a playlist, a music playlist that I use at the beginning of every class, where I pull songs from students' lockers. And they light up when they realize, oh, it's my favorite song that we're all listening to at the beginning. Or I invent lessons or make examples that connect back to some of the things that they included. So this activity really helps create a welcoming and inclusive classroom environment where students feel really brave, sort of sharing of themselves and bringing their whole selves to the classroom. I included just a couple of examples of the types of lockers that students have created over the years. You'll notice that these are ones that use avatars. Some students choose to include photographs of themselves. Other students choose to include avatars. But I wanted to just give you a quick sense of the breadth of ways that students approach this activity and the parts of themselves that they choose to share with other students in the classroom. I was surprised by the way that activities like this enabled me to create online classes that actually felt as human as my face-to-face classes did. That wasn't something I expected, and it's been a real opportunity to feel like I'm getting to know my students and they're getting to know each other, even though we're in a fully online environment. So you have access to the assignment instructions as well as the Google Slide template. I hope it's useful to you as you are working with your own classes.